Good evening, this is Mr. Wintermelon. So in this video, you will learn bulk of the content of this chapter of homeostasis, which is the regulation of our body temperature. And to be honest, if you ask me, this chapter might as well call regulation of our body temperature, because in the previous video, you only need to learn about what is homeostasis and negative feedback. The two other examples of homeostasis, you have already learned it in previous chapter. So the new content that you will learn will be how to identify the structure of our skin, as well as describe how our body maintains a constant body temperature. So first of all, let's go through how heat is gained or lost from our body. So there are a few ways which heat can be lost or gained, not limited to the example that I'm giving. Heat can be gained through respiration as well as muscle contraction. So muscle contraction itself, right, actually also require respiration. So they are tied together. When we consume hot food, the food will warm our body up because the hot food, the temperature is higher. So heat will travel from a region of higher temperature to a region of lower temperature, which is our body. So our body will gain heat in this way. Warm environment, let's say the temperature of the sauna is higher than our body temperature, our body will also gain heat. Now, you might be wondering, Mr. Wintermelon, didn't you mention earlier that we are endotherm? That means we can regulate our body temperature. How come our body will gain or lose heat? Now, our body will still gain or lose heat, just that we have our homeostasis to provide the negative feedback. That means when heat is gained, it will trigger some body response for us to lose more heat so as to decrease our body temperature. So it is not like I say that we are warm-blooded animal or endotherm, then our body temperature is constant throughout. No. Our body temperature can increase or decrease, and if the increase is too drastic or the decrease is too drastic, it will trigger a negative feedback in order for our body to regulate our body temperature back into the normal range. So next, let us look at how heat can be lost. The most important way of heat loss, at least for this chapter, is evaporation of our sweat. So when the sweat absorbs our body heat and evaporates, it will take away our body heat because heat is needed to cause the sweat to evaporate. When we urine or when we eject, so some of you, when you go to toilet to pee, you might suddenly feel a chill because we are losing heat. When we breathe out, and of course, heat can also be lost through radiation from our skin as well. This is also a very important ways which heat is lost that you have to know. So how is our body temperature regulated when we gain or lose heat? The part of our body responsible for regulating our body temperature is our hypothalamus. You should already be familiar with hypothalamus. We have mentioned it in the chapter of excretion. So hypothalamus is part of the brain where you can see in the diagram that is highlighted in green color. Then underneath is your pituitary gland, but we are not concerned about pituitary gland today. So this hypothalamus will trigger a response when there is a decrease or increase in our body temperature. And hypothalamus needs help from receptor. And there are two sets of thermoreceptor in our body that is responsible for sending signal to the hypothalamus for it to trigger a response. What is thermoreceptor? Basically, there are cells that are sensitive to change in temperature. So when it's too hot or when it's too cold, they will send signal to our hypothalamus in order for a response to be triggered. The first group of receptor is underneath our skin, and they are responsible for sensing the surrounding temperature. And they will send signal to our hypothalamus to tell our hypothalamus whether we are in a hot place or a cold place. It's worth noting that those thermoreceptor is only telling our hypothalamus the surrounding temperature, but it wouldn't trigger a homeostasis response because the surrounding temperature is not equal to the temperature inside our body. Our body will only need to respond if there's a change in the internal environment. But what is important about this receptor is, let's say we step into a very cold room. This receptor will sense that our surrounding is cold, then maybe we will grab a shirt or a jacket to wear. And this will also help to maintain our body temperature. But wearing a jacket is not homeostasis because it is not an internal response. For the internal response, it requires the other set of receptor. And the other set of thermoreceptor is actually found in the hypothalamus itself. And this set of receptor actually sense change in temperature of our blood. So for this set of receptor, when it senses that our blood is getting too hot or our blood is getting too cold, it will trigger a negative feedback. So how does the temperature of our blood increase or decrease if the surrounding temperature doesn't change? It can occur when we exercise. So when we exercise, there's muscle contraction, there's respiration. So what happens is heat will be produced inside our body and it will heat up our blood. And when this happens, our hypothalamus will detect that there's a change and trigger a response to increase heat loss. Another reason why our body temperature can change can also be due to the surrounding temperature. So normally, let's say we are sitting down here, we are losing heat to the surrounding because our body temperature is around 36.9 degrees Celsius and our surrounding temperature is lower. So definitely we will be losing heat. Now, let's say we step outside and expose ourselves to the hot sun. Even though it's hot outside, the surrounding temperature is actually still lower than our body temperature because the hottest that you might expect, unless you are in a desert, is around 33 degrees Celsius or 32. So it's still lower than our body temperature. So our body will still be losing heat to the surrounding. However, we will be losing lesser amount of heat to the surrounding. At the same time, our body will still be generating the same amount of heat because we are not increasing the amount of respiration or muscle contraction in our body. So right now, even though the thermoreceptor in our skin has picked up that the surrounding temperature is higher, and this is because a large amount of energy is needed to increase the temperature of water, and our blood plasma is mainly made up of water. So what this thermoreceptor in our skin does is letting our brain know that we are in a hot place, and our brain might start thinking, oh, maybe it's a good idea that I open my umbrella so to decrease my exposure to the sun. So this is what the hypothalamus will respond when it receives feedback from the thermoreceptor in our skin. However, since we are losing less heat to the surrounding, eventually the temperature of our blood will increase. And when the temperature of our blood increases, our hypothalamus will detect this increase and it will trigger a response causing us to lose more heat to the surrounding. So in this way, we are losing the same amount of heat indoor and outdoor so that the constant body temperature is being maintained. Next, let us take a look at the structure of our skin. So here are the important structure that you have to be able to recognize. Let us start from the top. First of all, we have our hair. It should be very recognizable. Just take note that the strand down there is the hair, not the hair follicle. Then we have our blood capillary as well as shunt vessel. Now, it's important to recognize which one is the blood capillary and which one is the shunt vessel. Shunt vessel will be the lowest vessel that is connecting the arteriole to the venous, while the blood capillary are the few blood vessels that is closest to the surface of the skin. So please take note of this difference. It is important to take note that there's a difference between capillary as well as shunt vessel. Shunt vessel is more like an arteriole because it can dilate, that means become wider, and allow more blood to flow directly from the arteriole to the venous instead of flowing to the blood capillary. At the same time, the shunt vessel can also contract. So when it's contract, less blood will flow directly from the arteriole to the venous, and as a result, more blood will be flowing to the blood capillary. So this is important to take note when we go on to the next slide. So beside the shunt vessel, we have our arteriole and venous, which I have mentioned. To the right hand side, there's thermoreceptor, which I have mentioned earlier on. There are two sets of thermoreceptor. One set is at the skin surface, as you can see down here, and the other is in our hypothalamus. So these two sets you have to know, and at least for O-level syllabus, we tell you there's two sets. Yeah, of course there are more lah, just that for O-level, you only need to know two. Then underneath, there is sweat gland. You can see that sweat gland comes into close approximation with our blood vessel. This is important because all of you should know that sweat is water. And where does the water comes from? Maybe you never thought of it, but the water from our sweat actually comes from our blood. Then you might be worried, then why is our sweat not red color? Well, that's because sweat is produced when the water in the blood plasma diffuse out of the blood vessel through osmosis. So you can imagine that when the blood vessel comes close to the sweat gland, the water molecules from the blood plasma will move out through osmosis. Then our sweat gland will secrete them out from our skin. Lastly, there's adipose tissue. Adipose tissue are fat cells, which are cells that specialize in storing fats. So these fats is important to provide insulation to protect us against the cold, because they are bad conductor of heat. And this is why you can see a lot of animal in the Arctic or Antarctic area in very cold places with thick layer of adipose tissue, because they need it to protect themselves against the cold. So how are the structure of the skin involved in temperature regulation? The thermoreceptor, as I have went through, will detect the change in surrounding temperature, and they will send signal to our hypothalamus that will trigger a response. The arteriole, they can either dilate meaning relax, or they can constrict meaning they contract. So when our arteriole is dilating, the blood vessel will become wider, they will send more blood to our skin, and more heat will be lost by radiation. So this one you can actually easily observe. When someone exercise, you can see that their face actually become more red, and that is because their arteriole will actually dilate and more blood will be pumped to the surface of their skin so that heat can be lost through radiation from the surface of our skin. And the reverse is true. Let's say we are in a cold environment, the arteriole will constrict and they will become more narrow. So when they become more narrow, you will expect less blood to be flow to the skin, and this will reduce heat loss. The shunt vessel, as I have emphasized earlier on, connects the arteriole to the venues. So what's the function of this shunt vessel, right? It's actually provide a direct passage from our artery to our venues. And when shunt vessel constrict, right, that means they reduce in the size of their lumen, it will reduce the blood flowing from the arteriole to the venue. And when this happens, more blood will be delivered to our skin. And when shunt vessel actually dilates, right, more blood will be able to flow from the arteriole directly to our venue. So when this happens, less blood will be flowing to the surface of our skin, because blood have been shunned or directly transported from the arteriole to the venue, bypassing the blood capillary. As for our hair will stand and traps heat, but not really very effective in human, I would say. Sweat glands will produce sweat, and our sweat is just water, so the sweat gland will secrete water, and together salt and urea will also be lost. So what happens is when we sweat, right, the water will gain heat from our body. So our body will actually lose heat to the sweat. And eventually when the sweat evaporates, it will cool our body. And lastly, the fatty tissue, like I said, they store fats and provide a layer of insulation to reduce heat loss. So to put the whole sequence of event into words, right, let us just go through what happened when our body temperature increased. So first of all, our hypothalamus will detect the changes from the change in temperature of our blood plasma. And the response that will be triggered is our arteriole in the skin will dilate and the shunt vessel will constrict. So this will increase the blood flow through the blood capillary, and increased heat will be lost through radiation. Our sweat gland will produce more sweat, and those sweat will gain heat from our body, and when they evaporate, they will remove heat from our body, since they are gaining heat from our body. Our metabolic rate might decrease to reduce the amount of heat generated within our body. However, just take note, the word metabolism isn't a chemical reaction. When they ask you what is the chemical reaction that generates heat from our body, is actually just respiration. Our hair erectile muscle will relax so that our hair will not stand and try to trap heat. And all of this will result in the negative feedback of our temperature dropping, because we will be losing more heat. And when our body temperature falls below normal, again, our hypothalamus will detect the changes. Arterioles in the skin will constrict and shunt vessel will dilate, so that less blood will be sent to our blood capillaries in our skin. And this will result in a decrease in heat loss through radiation. Sweat gland will produce less sweat, and we will lose less heat due to the evaporation of sweat. We will try to increase our metabolism, and one of these methods is by shivering, because for us to shiver, it requires muscle contraction. And what chemical reaction drives muscle contraction? Our respiration will provide the energy needed for muscle contraction, and respiration actually generates heat. And lastly, our hair erectile muscle will contract, causing our hair to stand and try to trap some heat. But of course, we are quite naked, and not much heat can be trapped by our standing hair. So this will actually be all for this chapter, and please copy this down as well as familiarize yourself with the structure of the skin. And that's all.